The chamber lights turned red before anyone said a word, and I knew something had gone terribly wrong. I was standing in the observation gallery of the Great Council Hall, a structure so vast it made every building on Earth look like a toy. Rings of glass and metal rose above a circular floor where representatives of 11 different species sat in judgment. I was there as a junior aide to Ambassador Nathaniel Hollis, the highest-ranking human official on the Council homeworld. My name is Clara Bennett, and until that moment, I believed diplomacy could solve almost anything. Ambassador Hollis stood alone in the center of that vast floor. He had asked me to wait upstairs, out of caution, though neither of us truly believed we needed caution. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply spent the last several months sharing pieces of human history with a group of young council scholars who had asked, out of pure curiosity, what humanity used to be like before it reached the stars. He told them about our wars, our mistakes, our recoveries. He told them how we clawed our way out of ruin and built something better. He thought it was a story of hope. The council saw it differently. They called it cultural contamination. They said his stories were dangerous, that they might inspire smaller species to consider conflict as a path to strength, that human history was a poison better left sealed away. I remember laughing when I first heard the accusation, because it seemed too absurd to be real. Nobody laughs at a joke that turns out to be a verdict. The presiding counselor, a tall silver-skinned being named Thren Vashari, rose from the central dais. His voice echoed through hidden speakers, calm and measured, the kind of voice that had delivered 1,000 routine rulings and expected this to be another. Ambassador Nathaniel Hollis, he said, you stand accused of endangering galactic stability through the unauthorized transmission of destabilizing historical narrative. The Council has reviewed the evidence. The Council has reached its decision. I gripped the railing in front of me. Something about the stillness in the hall told me this wasn't going to end the way it always did, with a fine, a formal warning, a demand for an apology broadcast across a dozen networks. The verdict is guilty, Vashari said. The sentence is immediate. Immediate. I had heard that word used in council proceedings before, but only for property disputes, trade violations, minor infractions solved with the snap of a data terminal. I had never heard it used like this, not paired with a living person standing exposed on an open floor. 2 security drones descended from the ceiling, sleek constructs of dark metal that I had only ever seen used for crowd containment during large diplomatic events. They hovered on either side of Ambassador Hollis, close enough that I could see him straighten his spine, refusing to flinch. He looked up at the gallery. He looked directly at me. I don't know what expression was on my face in that moment, but I know what was on his. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to disappointment, as if he had expected humanity's neighbors to be better than this, and was quietly sad to be proven wrong one final time. I opened my mouth to shout something, anything, a protest, an appeal, a plea for delay. Before a single word left my throat, the drones activated. It was over, in less than 2 seconds. The whole did not gasp. The whole did not react at all. 11 species watched a human ambassador executed on the floor of their highest court, and the only sound was the soft hum of ventilation systems recycling the air, as if nothing of consequence had happened. I don't remember walking out of the gallery. I don't remember the corridor, or the elevator, or the long walk back to the human embassy compound on the outskirts of the council district. My body carried me there, while my mind stayed frozen on that floor, replaying 2 seconds over and over, searching for some version of events where I had done something different, said something sooner, moved faster. There was nothing I could have done. I understood that intellectually. It didn't help. When I reached the embassy, the staff already knew. Word travels strangely fast in a place built on instantaneous communication networks. People stood in small clusters in the hallways, murmuring, some crying, some simply staring at walls. Nobody looked at me directly. I think they were afraid that if they did, they would have to acknowledge that I had been the closest one to him, the one who watched it happen without being able to stop it. I went to the communication office because it was the only thing I could think to do. My hands were shaking so badly that the technician had to help me open the secure channel to Earth. I don't remember exactly what I said in that first transmission. I remember the feeling of the words leaving me, more instinct than composition. They killed him. They killed him in front of everyone. I remember staring at the blinking indicator that showed the message had been sent, successfully compressed and folded through the relay network that connected Council space to Earth across an ocean of stars. I remember waiting for a response, expecting outrage, expecting officials to demand answers, expecting the kind of urgent diplomatic scramble that I had read about in history archives whenever tensions flared between nations centuries ago. What I got instead was silence. Not immediately. That would have felt almost normal. The silence came a little later, after the first wave of confused, grieving replies from colleagues and friends who had known Ambassador Hollis personally. Those messages came quickly, full of shock and sorrow, the kind of human reaction I expected. But underneath them, from the official channels, from Earth Command, from the diplomatic office, from anyone with actual authority, there was nothing. I sat in that communication office for hours, watching the indicator, refreshing the feed, checking every possible channel. Nothing arrived. No statement, no demand for explanation, no condemnation. It was as though Earth had simply stopped speaking. I remember one of the embassy staff, a quiet man named Elliot Marsh who had worked in the council district for almost a decade, standing beside me at some point in the night. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was something in his expression that unsettled me more than grief. It looked like recognition. "They're not going to say anything," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Someone has to respond. Someone has to demand." "No," he said, cutting me off gently. "You don't understand. This isn't the kind of thing Earth responds to with words." I didn't understand what he meant, not then. I assumed he was simply in shock, saying things that didn't quite make sense because his mind was struggling to process what he had just witnessed through the same feeds I had. Around us, in the following hours, other species stationed in the diplomatic district began treating us differently. I noticed it first in small ways. A Velithi trade attaché who used to nod politely to me in the corridors now crossed to the other side whenever she saw me coming. A pair of council security officers who had always been courteous during routine checks now watched us with something closer to caution, as if we might do something unpredictable. I heard whispers, some not bothering to lower their voices, suggesting that humanity had finally learned its place, that the execution had been a message, and the message had landed, that humans, for all their supposed resilience, were simply another species that could be controlled through fear once the right lesson was delivered. I wanted to scream at them that they were wrong, but I didn't know why I felt that so strongly. I only had a feeling, buried somewhere instinctual, that whispered the opposite of what they believed. Humanity going silent was never the same as humanity going quiet in surrender. I thought about history lessons from childhood, stories about ancient conflicts long before the stars, about nations that learned the hardest way possible that silence from an opponent could be far more dangerous than noise. I thought about phrases my grandmother used to say, passed down from a time before unification, about how the quietest room is often the one right before something changes forever. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the terminal, watching, waiting, hoping for something, anything, some sign that someone back home understood what had been done to us. Just before dawn on the station's artificial cycle, a single message arrived. Not from a person, not from an official. It was automated, formatted in the plain, unembellished style Earth Command used for critical system alerts, the kind normally reserved for natural disasters or infrastructure failures. Protocol threshold reached. Stand by. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. There was no context, no explanation, no follow-up. Just those 4 words, sitting on the screen like a locked door. I asked Elliot Marsh if he had ever seen a message like that before. He shook his head slowly, but he didn't look surprised so much as grim, like a man watching weather patterns gather on the horizon that he recognized from old stories, but had never personally witnessed. "There are protocols," he said carefully, "that most of us have only heard about in training briefings. Things written into Earth's founding charters after unification, back when the world was rebuilding itself from its worst mistakes. I always assumed they were symbolic, historical relics. I never thought I would see one triggered. Triggered by what? He looked at me, and for the first time since the execution, something like fear crossed his face, though not fear for himself. By exactly what happened today, he said. The killing of an accredited human envoy, carried out by a governing body, without due process recognized under interstellar law. There's a name for the response that follows. I've only ever seen it written down. Annihilation Protocol. The words hit me strangely. They sounded almost theatrical, like something out of an old film, rather than an actual policy embedded in the operating framework of an entire civilization. And yet the calm certainty in his voice made the phrase feel far heavier than fiction. What does it mean? I asked. What actually happens? He hesitated, glancing toward the window that overlooked the council district beyond our compound walls, its towers glittering under a sky full of unfamiliar stars. I don't fully know, he admitted. Nobody outside a small circle in Earth Command does. But I know it isn't rage. It isn't a declaration of war in the way the council would expect. It's older than that. Colder. More deliberate. Earth doesn't shout when it's about to act. It goes quiet, and it plans, and then it finishes what needs finishing. I spent the rest of that long night trying to piece together fragments of what he told me, with half-remembered lessons from mandatory history courses everyone took growing up on Earth. We were taught, in careful, sanitized language, about a period centuries ago when humanity nearly destroyed itself through impulsive retaliation, cycles of violence that spiraled out of control because leaders acted from anger rather than principle. After that era, in the long rebuilding that followed, a new philosophy took hold, one that shaped everything about how Earth conducted itself afterward. Never again would decisions of consequence be made in anger. Never again would retaliation be immediate, chaotic, or driven by emotion. Instead, a framework was built, a slow, deliberate, almost bureaucratic process, designed specifically to prevent the kind of impulsive escalation that had once nearly ended us. It was built to be triggered only under the most extreme circumstances, and once triggered, it was built to be unstoppable, precisely because its slowness meant every step had already been considered, debated, and locked into policy long before any crisis actually occurred. I didn't know, sitting there in the gray hours before an artificial dawn, whether this was true, or whether it was simply the kind of story frightened people tell themselves to make an unbearable situation feel like it has some hidden logic. All I knew for certain was that somewhere far across the stars, on a world I hadn't seen in over 2 years, something had shifted. A switch, long dormant, had been thrown, and nobody back home was in any hurry to explain what would happen next. I looked out the window at the council district, its buildings gleaming with the confidence of civilizations that had never truly been tested, and I felt a strange, quiet certainty settle over the grief still sitting heavy in my chest. Whatever silence Earth had chosen, it was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of something enormous, deciding exactly where to begin. 3 days passed before anything changed, and those 3 days felt longer than the 2 years I had already spent stationed in the council district. The embassy compound settled into an uneasy rhythm. Staff still reported to their posts, still filed routine paperwork, still answered calls from council offices asking about trade schedules and diplomatic courtesies, as though the world hadn't tilted sideways beneath us. I understood later that this was deliberate. Earth Command had sent a brief directive to every human office across council space, instructing all personnel to maintain normal operations and avoid any public statement about the execution, no press conferences, no formal protests, no angry rebuttals broadcast across the council networks. Just ordinary function, as if nothing unusual had occurred at all. I hated it at first. Every fiber of my being wanted someone, anyone, to stand up and say what had happened was wrong, to demand accountability, to make the council feel even a fraction of the horror I had felt watching Ambassador Hollis die on that open floor. Instead, we were told to be quiet, to be patient, to wait. Elliot Marsh found me on the second day, sitting alone in the small courtyard behind the embassy library, staring at nothing in particular. He set a cup of tea beside me without asking if I wanted it, then lowered himself onto the bench across from me. "You're angry that we're not doing anything," he said. "Aren't you?" The first time I read about doctrine like this in training, it felt cowardly. It felt like we were supposed to be better than that, stronger than that. It took me a long time to understand that quiet isn't the same as weak. I turned to look at him properly, in the strange light of the courtyard, filtered through an artificial sky designed to mimic something like an Earth sunset. His face looked older than I remembered from just a few days earlier. "Tell me what you know," I said. "All of it." "I don't care if it's classified. I watched him die, Elliot. I deserve to understand what happens now." He studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "What I know comes mostly from a mandatory briefing every diplomatic officer receives before deployment," he said. "Most of us barely remember the details because we assume we'll never need them. The briefing describes a legal framework built into Earth's founding charter, drafted during the Reconstruction era after the Old Wars. It establishes a very narrow, very specific condition. If a lawfully accredited envoy of Earth is killed by the deliberate action of a governing body, without due process recognized under the interstellar accords Earth itself helped write, then a formal state of consequence is triggered automatically. Automatically, I repeated, not by a vote. Not by a decision made in anger. That's exactly the point, Eliot said. The people who wrote this doctrine understood something about themselves. They knew that in the heat of grief and outrage, leaders make terrible decisions. So they built a system that removes emotion from the equation entirely. The moment the condition is met, the protocol activates on its own, according to rules decided long before any of us were born, by people who could not have known who would eventually trigger it, or why, or against whom. I thought about the message I had seen glowing on that terminal screen in the early hours after the execution. Protocol threshold reached. Stand by. It hadn't been written by a person reacting to grief. It had been generated automatically, the moment certain conditions were satisfied, exactly as Eliot described. "What happens next?" I asked. "I genuinely don't know the specifics," he admitted. "That part of the doctrine is classified well above anything I've ever had access to, but I know the general shape of it from what little has leaked through unofficial channels over the years. There is an assessment period, where systems back on Earth confirm the conditions were legitimately met, ruling out any possibility of misunderstanding or manipulation. Then there is a formal declaration, made not to us, but to the offending party directly, and then there is a response." "What kind of response?" Eliot shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody outside a very small circle knows. That's what worries me more than anything. In all the years I've served out here, watching the Council underestimate humanity again and again, I've never seen us actually reach this threshold. I always assumed it existed purely as a deterrent, something written down to sound impressive, but never meant to actually be used. And now I think we're about to learn exactly how real it is." That evening, official confirmation came through the embassy's secure feed, forwarded from Earth Command with unusual formality. It wasn't addressed to us directly. It was a copy of a declaration that had, according to the header information, already been transmitted directly to the Council's highest governing office. I read it standing in the communication office, Eliot beside me, both of us silent as the words scrolled across the screen. The declaration was formal, precise, almost unsettlingly calm in its language. It stated plainly that the Council had, through the sanctioned execution of Ambassador Nathaniel Hollis, violated the foundational terms of the interstellar accords governing diplomatic conduct between sovereign civilizations. It stated that this violation satisfied the conditions for what the document referred to only as the Annihilation Protocol, a term I had now heard enough times that it no longer sounded theatrical. It sounded like a verdict of its own. The declaration did not threaten violence outright. It did not use aggressive language at all. Instead, it read almost like a legal notice, informing the Council that Earth considered all prior treaties and diplomatic understandings between the two governments to be suspended pending resolution, and that a designated response vessel would arrive at the border of Council space to deliver further terms in person. A single vessel. I remember laughing when I read that line, a short, disbelieving sound that had nothing to do with humor. An entire coalition of 11 species, controlling thousands of systems, fielding fleets that could blot out stars with their numbers, and Earth's response was to send one ship. "That has to be a mistake," I said. "Or a bluff. Or something lost in translation." Elliot didn't answer right away. He was staring at the declaration with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something between disbelief and quiet, dawning understanding. "It's not a mistake," he said finally. "I think that's the point. I think they want the council to underestimate what's coming." Within hours, the news had spread throughout the diplomatic district, first as rumor, then as confirmed fact once council officials themselves began reacting publicly. I watched the reaction unfold across various species broadcast networks, translated in real time by the embassy's systems. Reactions ranged from confusion to open mockery. A prominent council commentator, a broad-shouldered Threxian analyst known for his confident predictions on interstellar affairs, appeared on one of the widely viewed networks within the district, laughing openly at the idea that a single Earth vessel posed any credible threat to the combined might of council defenses. "One ship," he said, gesturing dismissively at a floating display showing basic specifications pulled from outdated intelligence files. "One single vessel against a coordinated defense grid spanning 11 species and thousands of warships. This is not a declaration of war. This is theater. Humanity postures because it knows it cannot act. It sends a single ship because it has nothing else to send." I wanted to believe him. Some small, exhausted part of me wanted nothing more than for this entire crisis to dissolve into an embarrassing miscalculation on Earth's part, something that could be resolved with formal apologies and diplomatic corrections rather than whatever unknown consequence loomed on the horizon. But I kept remembering the calm, deliberate tone of that declaration. I kept remembering Eliot's words about a doctrine built specifically to remove emotion from the equation, designed by people who understood that overwhelming force delivered without hesitation required no exaggeration, no dramatic build-up, no accompanying fleet to prove a point that a single, precisely deployed asset could prove entirely on its own. 2 days after the declaration was transmitted, sensor networks across the border systems of council space detected an anomaly. A single contact, appearing without warning at the very edge of monitored space, exactly where Earth's declaration had promised it would arrive. I watched the sensor feed alongside Elliot and a dozen other embassy staff crowded into the communication office, all of us staring at a single blinking marker on a star chart that suddenly felt far too small to contain everything that marker represented. The vessel did not advance. It did not attempt to breach council territory. It simply sat at the boundary, broadcasting nothing, moving nowhere, as still and patient as a held breath. Council Defense Command, according to intercepted transmissions our systems managed to capture, scrambled an immediate response, dispatching a substantial portion of the border fleet to investigate and, if necessary, neutralize the intruder before it could advance any further into protected space. I remember the Threxian analyst's confident dismissal echoing in my mind as I watched dozens of council warships assemble into formation on the sensor display, arranging themselves around that single, unmoving marker, like predators closing in on something far smaller than themselves. Elliot stood beside me, arms crossed, watching the same display with an expression that had settled into something quiet and unreadable. "They still don't understand," he murmured, almost to himself. "Understand what?" He didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the marker on the screen, waiting, the same way the rest of us were waiting, though I suspected he already knew, on some level, exactly what was about to unfold. "They think numbers win," he finally said. "They've never had to learn otherwise." Outside the embassy windows, the artificial sky of the council district glowed with its usual manufactured serenity, utterly indifferent to the fact that somewhere beyond its borders, a single human vessel sat waiting, patient and silent, while an entire coalition prepared to make a mistake it would spend the rest of its history trying to understand. I need to explain something about myself before I go further, because it helps explain why I understood what was coming before most of the people around me did. I did not grow up in a diplomatic family. I grew up in a small coastal town on Earth, raised by a mother who had served for 20 years in Earth's Historical Archive Division, cataloging records from the Reconstruction era that most people never bothered to read. She used to tell me stories at night, not fairy tales, but real accounts pulled from declassified files, stories about the old wars, and the long, painful process of rebuilding that followed. I used to think she told me these stories to frighten me into appreciating peace. It took me years to realize she told me these stories so I would understand exactly what peace had cost, and exactly what price humanity had decided it would never pay again through carelessness or hesitation. One story she told me more than any other was about a philosophy adopted during the final years of Reconstruction, when the leaders rebuilding Earth's fractured governments debated how the new unified world should conduct itself going forward. There had been two competing ideas. One camp argued for a doctrine of visible strength, large standing fleets, aggressive posturing, a constant demonstration of capability meant to discourage anyone from ever considering Earth an easy target. The other camp argued for something quieter. They believed that visible strength invited challenge, that species and factions would always test the limits of whatever power was paraded in front of them, searching for weakness, searching for an opening. The quiet camp won that debate, and the doctrine they wrote reflected their belief completely. Earth would maintain the smallest visible military presence necessary for basic security. It would avoid displays of force, avoid provocative posturing, avoid anything that might invite comparison or competition. Instead, its actual strength would remain almost entirely unseen, developed methodically, tested rigorously, held in reserve for the singular purpose of responding, with total certainty, to any violation of the few absolute lines Earth refused to allow anyone to cross. The killing of an accredited envoy was one of those lines. It had been one of those lines since the very first draft of the doctrine, centuries before Earth ever made contact with another species, written by people who could not have imagined the Council, or Ambassador Hollis, or the exact chamber in which he would eventually die. They wrote the line anyway, because they understood something timeless about power and diplomacy. A civilization that cannot guarantee the safety of its representatives cannot function as a civilization at all. Every treaty, every negotiation, every fragile agreement between different peoples depends entirely on the basic assumption that the people sent to negotiate will not be murdered for the crime of representing an unfamiliar culture. I remembered all of this while standing in that crowded communication office, watching the Council's border fleet arrange itself around a single unmoving marker on the sensor display. I remembered it, and for the first time since the execution, the fear in my chest began to feel less like helplessness and more like grim anticipation. The Council Fleet Commander, according to intercepted communications our systems captured and translated, ordered the assembled ships to hold position at a cautious distance, broadcasting a formal demand for the intruding vessel to identify itself and withdraw immediately from what the Council still considered contested border space. There was no response. For nearly 6 hours, the human vessel simply sat there, motionless, silent, while Council ships slowly tightened their formation around it, sensors probing, weapons systems quietly powering to standby readiness. I imagine, looking back, that this silence unsettled the Council commanders far more than any aggressive maneuver could have. An unpredictable opponent can be planned against, countered, anticipated based on assumed instincts. A perfectly patient opponent, one who reveals nothing of its intentions, offers nothing for an adversary's strategy to grip onto. Then, exactly 6 hours after the fleet completed its encirclement, the human vessel finally transmitted something. Not a threat, not a demand. A single data packet, broadcast openly across every frequency the Council fleet monitored, along with every civilian and diplomatic channel operating within range, including our own embassy systems. I watched it arrive on our terminal in real time, translated instantly by our systems into the standard Council trade language used across most of interstellar space. It was a countdown. Beneath the numbers, a short identification string labeled the vessel by name. Last warning. I remember the room falling completely silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. A countdown, ticking downward from a specific number of hours, attached to no further explanation, no accompanying threat, no demand for surrender or negotiation, just a name and a number, steadily decreasing. Elliot stared at the display for a long moment before speaking, They're telling them exactly how much time they have left to reconsider. Reconsider what? Asked one of the younger embassy staff, a nervous man named Julian Ashford, who had only been stationed in the council district for a few months. Reconsider surrounding the ship? Reconsider the whole encounter? I don't think it matters to them what the council reconsiders, Elliot said quietly. I think the countdown isn't a negotiation tactic at all. I think it's simply informing them of when something is going to happen, regardless of what they decide to do about it. The Threxian analyst who had so confidently dismissed the human vessel days earlier reappeared on council broadcast networks that evening, his tone noticeably less certain than before, though he still maintained a veneer of confidence for his audience. He described the countdown as an obvious attempt at psychological intimidation, a crude tactic meant to provoke fear rather than demonstrate any genuine capability. He reminded viewers that a single vessel, no matter how advanced, could not possibly withstand the combined firepower of the assembled council fleet, should that fleet choose to act preemptively rather than wait passively for whatever the countdown was building toward. Council Command, apparently swayed by similar reasoning, made their decision roughly halfway through the remaining countdown period. Rather than wait to discover what the human vessel intended, they would eliminate the threat entirely, using overwhelming numerical superiority to destroy the ship before its countdown could reach 0. I learned about this decision the same way I learned about most developments during that tense period, through intercepted fleet communications that our embassy's intelligence systems managed to capture and decode. I remember reading the order, translated into careful, clinical language, authorizing the border fleet to commence a coordinated strike against the vessel designated Last Warning, effective immediately. I looked at Elliot when I read it, searching his face for some sign of reassurance, some indication that this was simply posturing that would resolve itself before anything irreversible occurred. He offered none. He simply watched the sensor display, waiting. The same quiet, grim patience settled over his features that I had noticed days earlier. "They're going to attack it," I said. "Yes," he replied. "Shouldn't we be doing something? Shouldn't someone be warning them not to?" Elliot turned to look at me then, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten, with a dread I couldn't quite name. "Clara," he said gently, "I don't think it would matter if we warned them. I don't think there's anything we could say that would change what's about to happen, and I don't think, given everything that ship represents, that anyone back home would want us to try." I stood there, staring at the sensor display, watching dozens of council warships begin adjusting their formation, weapons systems fully active now, preparing to converge on a single, silent, unmoving vessel that had done nothing since its arrival except wait, patient and unblinking, for exactly this moment. The countdown on our screen continued ticking downward, indifferent to the council fleet's decision, indifferent to the mounting tension in that crowded communication office, indifferent to everything except whatever precise, predetermined moment it had been engineered to reach. I realized, watching those numbers fall, that I was witnessing something far larger than a single confrontation between one ship and an assembled fleet. I was witnessing the opening moment of a lesson that an entire coalition of species was about to learn, whether they wanted to or not, about the difference between visible strength and actual capability, about the difference between numbers on a sensor display and the quiet, terrible certainty of a civilization that never bluffed. Somewhere far above the council district, beyond the artificial sky and the gleaming towers and the confident murmurs of a coalition that had never truly been tested, that lesson was about to begin in earnest. The attack began without warning, exactly at the moment Council Command had authorized it, long before the countdown on our screen reached its final number. I suppose they believed striking early would grant them some advantage, catching the vessel off guard before whatever it was building toward could fully materialize. Dozens of warships opened fire simultaneously, a coordinated barrage designed to overwhelm any single target regardless of its defenses, a tactic that had apparently never failed the Council in centuries of maintaining order among smaller, less organized species. I watched the sensor display alongside everyone else crowded into that communication office, and for a brief, terrible moment, I thought the ship had actually been destroyed. The display flickered, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of energy readings flooding the area, sensor systems struggling to process the chaos unfolding at the border. Then the readings settled, and what remained on the screen made the entire room go silent. The human vessel was still there, untouched, not damaged, not scarred, not even marked by the residue of an attack that should have, by every calculation the Threxian analyst and council command had relied upon, reduced it to drifting debris. It sat exactly where it had been, patient and unmoving, as though the barrage that had just been unleashed against it amounted to nothing more than a passing weather pattern. I heard Julian Ashford, the young embassy staffer, whisper something under his breath, a question none of us could answer. How? Elliot didn't answer either, though I noticed his hands had tightened slightly where they rested against the console in front of him. Whatever calm certainty he had carried through the previous days seemed, for the first time, to waver slightly, not from doubt about Earth's capability, but from the sheer scale of what that capability apparently represented. The Council fleet, apparently as stunned as we were, hesitated for several long seconds before command ordered a second, more concentrated strike, redirecting every available weapon system toward the same coordinates in an attempt to saturate whatever defenses the vessel possessed. This time, the human ship responded. It didn't retaliate with brute force, the way I might have expected from stories of ancient wars fought between rival powers desperate to prove their strength. Instead, its response felt almost surgical, deliberate in a way that made the hair on my arms stand on end as I watched the sensor readings update in real time. One by one, the Council warships nearest the human vessel began losing power, not exploding, not burning, simply going dark, their weapon systems failing, their communication arrays falling silent, their engines drifting to a halt as though something had reached inside each ship and quietly, methodically switched them off from within. I didn't understand what I was watching, not fully, not in that moment. It took several minutes of confused, frantic analysis from our own embassy technicians to piece together what little we could observe from a distance. Whatever technology the human vessel employed, it wasn't destroying the Council ships outright. It was disabling them, precisely, without loss of life, without wreckage, without the kind of visible destruction that would have made for a dramatic, easily understood spectacle. It was, in its own way, far more unsettling than outright destruction would have been. Destruction could be explained as luck, as a lucky strike, as an unfortunate loss absorbed and moved past. This was something else entirely. This was a demonstration of complete and total control over the battlefield, delivered with a restraint that felt almost more frightening than violence itself, because it implied a level of confidence that made violence unnecessary. Within 20 minutes, nearly half the assembled Council fleet had gone dark, drifting uselessly at the border, their crews presumably alive but stranded, their vessels reduced to inert hulks without a single confirmed casualty. The remaining ships, apparently recognizing the situation, had moved entirely beyond their control, began a hasty, disorganized retreat, breaking formation and scattering back toward the interior of Council space, without waiting for further orders. The human vessel did not pursue them. It remained exactly where it had been throughout the entire encounter, motionless, silent, as though the confrontation that had just unfolded meant nothing to it beyond a brief interruption of its patient waiting. The countdown, which had continued ticking throughout the exchange, reached its final number just minutes after the retreating Council ships vanished from close-range sensor contact. At 0, the vessel transmitted a second message, broadcast across the same open frequencies as before, translated instantly by every system monitoring the encounter throughout Council space. I read the message on our terminal, and I have never forgotten the exact wording, simple and precise, utterly without embellishment. This was restraint. Nothing else followed. No demands, no further threats, no indication of what might come next. Just those 3 words, left to sit in the silence that followed, allowing an entire coalition of species to draw their own conclusions about what an absence of restraint might actually look like. Broadcast networks that had, only days earlier, dismissed the human vessel as an empty bluff, now scrambled to explain what had just happened, offering wildly inconsistent theories ranging from advanced disabling technology to some form of coordinated ambush involving hidden reinforcements nobody had detected. The Threxian analyst who had so confidently predicted the vessel's destruction did not reappear on the networks that evening. I don't know what became of him, though I suspect his confident predictions had become significantly less popular among his audience. Inside the embassy, the mood shifted from grief and uncertainty into something quieter, heavier, tinged with an emotion I struggled to name, until Elliot finally put words to it, during a brief moment we shared alone in the communication office, hours after the encounter had ended. "It's not relief," he said, seeming to read the confusion on my face. "It's recognition. We're finally starting to understand exactly what we've always been capable of, and exactly how carefully that capability has been hidden from us, as much as from anyone else." "You didn't know," I said, "about any of this, did you?" He shook his head slowly. "Nobody outside a very small circle knows the specifics of what Earth has actually developed over the centuries since Reconstruction. We've always assumed our technology was modest, competitive but unremarkable compared to some of the older Council species. I think that assumption was deliberate. I think we were meant to believe it, the same way the Council was meant to believe it, so that nobody would think to test it until it truly mattered." I thought about my mother's stories again, about the Reconstruction-era debates between visible strength and quiet preparation, about a civilization that decided, centuries ago, that the greatest advantage it could possess was one nobody else believed it had. I thought about Ambassador Hollis, standing calm and unafraid in his final moments, perhaps understanding, even then, that his death would not go unanswered, even if the answer took a form nobody in that chamber could have anticipated. Council leadership convened an emergency session within hours of the encounter, according to reports filtering through diplomatic channels still functioning despite the chaos. I wasn't present for those discussions, but I heard fragments through colleagues with access to lower-level briefings, describing a coalition thrown into genuine panic for what many officials admitted was the first time in generations. The immediate question facing Council leadership was simple, even if the answer remained elusive. If a single vessel could accomplish what had just occurred without suffering so much as a scratch, what exactly would Earth's full response look like, should the situation escalate further? Nobody wanted to find out. Nobody, apparently, had any confidence in their ability to prevent it if Earth decided that further escalation was warranted. I remained at the embassy that night, long after most of the staff had finally gone to rest, unable to sleep, watching the quiet, empty sensor display where the human vessel continued its patient vigil at the border. I thought about the phrase it had transmitted, 3 simple words that had reshaped an entire coalition's understanding of the galaxy in the span of a single encounter. This was restraint. I wondered, staring at that unmoving marker on the screen, what exactly restraint had looked like in this instance, and what might happen if that restraint were ever withdrawn entirely. I didn't have an answer. I don't think anyone in Council space had an answer either, and I suspected that uncertainty was precisely the point. 2 days after the border encounter, I received a summons I never expected. A formal message arrived at the embassy, addressed specifically to me, requesting my presence aboard a Council transport scheduled to depart for the border region within the hour. I stared at the message for a long time before showing it to Elliot, uncertain whether I was meant to feel honored or terrified. "They want you present for the negotiations," he said, after reading it over my shoulder. "You're the last senior human official who was physically present at the execution. You watched it happen. In their eyes, that makes you a witness they need in the room, someone whose account they can't simply dismiss as second-hand reporting. I'm not a negotiator, Elliot. I'm an aide. I filed reports and scheduled meetings. I've never represented Earth in anything that mattered." "You represented Earth the moment you stood in that gallery and watched what happened to Ambassador Hollis," he said quietly. "Whether you feel ready for this or not, you're what they have. And frankly, given everything I've seen over the last week, I think you understand what's at stake better than anyone else they could send." I boarded the transport with a knot of anxiety lodged firmly in my chest, uncertain what I would find when we arrived, uncertain whether my presence would matter at all in discussions that would likely be dominated by senior officials from both sides. The journey took several hours, and I spent most of it staring out at the passing stars, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to remember every detail of the execution I might need to recount with precision. When we arrived at the border station, a hastily constructed neutral platform assembled specifically for this purpose, I found the atmosphere far more chaotic than I expected. Council officials from multiple species crowded the corridors, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their usual composed diplomatic bearing replaced by something closer to barely restrained panic. I passed representatives I recognized from the trial itself, though none of them met my eyes as I walked by. I was led into a small conference room where a modest delegation waited, far smaller than I expected, given the magnitude of the crisis. Only a handful of senior council officials sat at the table, including Thren Vashari himself, the same presiding councillor who had delivered the verdict against Ambassador Hollis. He looked considerably less composed than he had during the trial, his usual measured confidence replaced by something tighter, more guarded. Across from them, on the human side of the table, sat only one person, a tall, weathered man in a simple, unadorned uniform, introduced to me quietly by an aide as Captain Owen Blackwood, commanding officer of the vessel Last Warning. He looked nothing like what I expected from someone commanding a ship capable of what I had witnessed at the border. He looked tired, calm, almost ordinary, the kind of face you might pass on any street on Earth without a second glance. He nodded to me as I took my seat beside him, a small gesture of acknowledgement that felt strangely reassuring given the tension filling the room. Councillor Vashari wasted no time once the session began. "Captain Blackwood," he said, his translated voice carrying an edge of barely concealed desperation, "the Council wishes to express its deepest regret regarding the incident involving Ambassador Hollis. We are prepared to offer substantial reparations, formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, whatever measures necessary to resolve this matter peacefully." Captain Blackwood listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, until Vashari finished speaking. "Councillor," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying none of the anger I might have expected given everything that had happened. "Earth did not send me here to negotiate an apology. We understand that the Council regrets the situation it now finds itself in. That regret changes nothing about what already occurred, and it changes nothing about the doctrine that governs our response." "Then what would satisfy Earth's demands?" Vashari asked, his voice tightening further. "Name a price. Name a concession. We are prepared to discuss reparations of any scale." "This isn't about a price," Blackwood replied. "Ambassador Hollis was executed without due process, based on an accusation that amounted to nothing more than sharing history with willing listeners. That is not an offense that can be resolved through reparations, because reparations imply a transaction, and this was never meant to be transactional. It was meant to establish, permanently, that killing an accredited envoy of Earth carries consequences no amount of wealth or apology can undo." The room fell silent. I watched Vashari's composure crack slightly further, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. "Then what is Earth's intention?" he asked, quieter now, almost pleading. "Total war? The destruction of the Council itself?" Blackwood shook his head. "Earth's doctrine was never built around destruction for its own sake. It was built around certainty of consequence, not punishment for punishment's sake. What we require is oversight. Permanent, binding oversight of Council diplomatic proceedings involving Earth representatives, structured specifically to ensure this can never happen again without immediate, verified consequence." I watched the Council delegation exchange uneasy glances, clearly having expected something far more catastrophic than a demand for oversight, and clearly uncertain whether this offer represented genuine mercy or something they hadn't yet fully understood. It was in that moment, watching the negotiations stall under the weight of mutual misunderstanding, that I finally found my voice. "May I speak?" I asked, surprising myself as much as everyone else in the room. Blackwood turned to look at me, and something in his expression, a flicker of curiosity perhaps, encouraged me to continue. "Councillor Vashari," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I think you're misunderstanding what's being offered here. Earth isn't asking for oversight as a punishment. It's asking for oversight as a safeguard, a mechanism to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy from happening again, to any species, not just to us. What happened to Ambassador Hollis wasn't just a crime against Earth. It was a failure of the entire system the Council claims to uphold, a system that allowed an accusation as thin as cultural contamination to result in an execution without any meaningful review. Vashari studied me carefully, something shifting behind his eyes. You believe this oversight would prevent future tragedies, rather than simply serve as a permanent reminder of this one. I believe, I said, that the alternative is far worse for everyone in this room. I watched what one ship could do without firing a single shot meant to kill. I don't think any of us want to discover what an entire fleet built on that same doctrine looks like when patience finally runs out. Captain Blackwood said nothing, but I noticed something in his posture ease slightly, as though my words had accomplished something he had been unable to achieve through formal doctrine alone. The negotiations continued for several more hours, difficult and tense, but gradually shifting from panicked bargaining towards something resembling genuine, structured compromise. By the end of the session, the outline of an agreement had taken shape, one that would require the Council to submit future diplomatic proceedings involving Earth representatives to binding external review, with permanent human oversight embedded into their judicial framework for matters concerning accredited envoys. It was not the apology I had wanted in the days immediately following the execution. It would never bring Ambassador Hollis back, and no amount of oversight could undo the 2 seconds I had watched unfold on that chamber floor. But it was, I began to understand, exactly the kind of consequence Earth's doctrine had been designed to achieve from the very beginning. Not vengeance, not destruction, certainty, the absolute, unshakable certainty that no governing body would ever again treat the life of an Earth envoy as something disposable, something that could be discarded for the sake of political theater without consequence. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out of the room, Captain Blackwood lingered behind for a moment, turning to me before I could leave. "You did well in there," he said quietly. "Better than most trained negotiators I've worked alongside." "I just said what seemed true," I replied. He nodded slowly. "That's usually the most effective thing anyone can say in a room like that." I left the border station that evening with a strange, hollow feeling settled in my chest. Not quite relief, not quite closure, but something adjacent to both. The crisis that had begun with an execution I couldn't prevent was ending, in its own way, with words I hadn't expected myself to speak, in a room I never imagined I would be important enough to occupy. News of the agreement spread through Council space within days, though the official narrative released to the wider public differed considerably from what I had personally witnessed in that small conference room. Council leadership framed the outcome as a mutual diplomatic resolution, a demonstration of goodwill and cooperative spirit between Earth and the Council, carefully avoiding any language that might suggest the coalition had been forced into submission by a single unarmed encounter at the border. I understood why they framed it that way, an admission of the true circumstances, that an entire coalition of 11 species had been maneuvered into binding oversight by the actions of one patient, restrained vessel, would have devastated Council credibility across every system under its influence. Smaller allied species, client worlds, and dependent territories all relied on the perception of Council strength to justify their continued participation in the coalition. A crack in that perception risked far more than embarrassment. It risked the unraveling of relationships the Council had spent centuries cultivating. But perception, I quickly learned, is a fragile thing once genuine cracks begin to show, regardless of how carefully those cracks are papered over by official statements. I remained stationed at the embassy for the following weeks as the formal oversight framework took shape, drafted through a series of tense but increasingly productive sessions between Earth representatives and Council legal officials. I found myself included in more of these discussions than I ever expected, my presence apparently valued now in a way it had never been before the crisis began. Elliot once joked, half seriously, that I had accidentally become one of the most senior human officials in the entire Council district. Simply by surviving an ordeal nobody else had been positioned to survive. I didn't feel like someone who had accomplished anything remarkable. I felt like someone who had simply refused to stay silent at the one moment silence would have cost us everything. During those weeks, I began noticing subtle but unmistakable shifts in how other species treated human personnel throughout the diplomatic district. The Velithi trade attaché who had once crossed the corridor to avoid me, now made a point of greeting me directly whenever our paths crossed, her demeanor carrying a kind of careful respect that hadn't existed before. Council security officers, who had once watched us with suspicion, now regarded human staff with something closer to wary deference. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear certainly played some part in the shift. It was something more complicated, a recalibration of assumptions that had governed interactions between species for as long as Earth had participated in council affairs. We had always been treated as the newest, least predictable member of the coalition, tolerated for our usefulness, but never fully trusted, never fully respected as equals among older, more established civilizations. That perception had shattered entirely in the span of a single encounter at the border. I spoke with a young Threxian scholar during that period, one of the same students who had originally asked Ambassador Hollis to share human history with them, the conversation that had ultimately led to his execution. She approached me cautiously one afternoon in the embassy library, clearly uncertain whether she would be welcome given everything that had happened because of her curiosity. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said quietly, her translated voice carrying genuine distress. "I only wanted to understand your history. I didn't know it would cost him his life." I remember studying her for a long moment, searching for anger within myself, and finding, to my own surprise, very little. "You didn't kill him," I said. "Curiosity isn't a crime, no matter what your council decided that day. If anything, I think what happened proves exactly why sharing our history matters. We survived our worst mistakes by learning from them honestly, without pretending they never happened. Maybe that's a lesson worth sharing, even if the cost of sharing it was higher than anyone should have had to pay." She seemed to consider this for a long moment before speaking again. "Is it true what people are saying? That Earth doctrine was built specifically because of mistakes like the ones your ambassador described to us?" "It's true," I said. "Everything Ambassador Hollis told you about our history was true. We nearly destroyed ourselves through exactly the kind of impulsive violence your council feared he might be teaching you to admire. But we didn't rebuild by hiding from that truth. We rebuilt by confronting it directly, by designing systems specifically to prevent us from ever repeating those mistakes, even when provoked, even when grieving, even when every instinct screamed for immediate retaliation. Then the doctrine that punished my council," she said slowly, "was born from the same philosophy Ambassador Hollis was trying to teach us. I hadn't considered it from quite that angle before, but as soon as she said it, I understood she was right. The very philosophy that had led to Ambassador Hollis's execution, the belief that human history was too dangerous to share, that our violent past made us inherently unstable, had been proven backward by the exact doctrine born from that same violent past. Earth's restraint at the border, its refusal to escalate into destruction, its insistence on structural safeguards rather than punishment, all of it traced directly back to lessons learned during the very era Ambassador Hollis had been executed for discussing. I relayed this conversation to Captain Blackwood during one of the final oversight sessions, curious to hear his perspective, given his direct role in delivering Earth's response. He listened carefully, nodding slowly once I finished. "That's exactly why the doctrine exists," he said. "Not to prove we're dangerous, but to prove we've learned something dangerous. Civilizations rarely manage to learn. Strength without restraint destroys everything it touches, eventually, even the civilization wielding it. We learned that the hard way, centuries ago, and we built an entire philosophy around never forgetting it. Do you think the Council understands that now?" I asked. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think they understand something changed. Whether they understand the deeper reason behind it, that's something only time will reveal. Doctrines like ours aren't meant to be understood immediately. They're meant to be tested, slowly, over generations, until eventually nobody remembers a time when the safeguard wasn't simply accepted as permanent fact." By the time the formal oversight agreement was finalized and signed by representatives from every council species, several months had passed since the execution that started everything. The document itself was remarkably modest in its final language, stripped of the punitive tone I had expected during those early, tense negotiations. It established clear, permanent protocols for reviewing any future proceedings involving accredited envoys from Earth, guaranteeing due process standards that exceeded even the Council's own internal judicial requirements, enforced through a joint oversight committee with binding authority to intervene before any irreversible action could be taken. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of solution Ambassador Hollis himself might have proposed had he lived to see the crisis resolved. Not vengeance, not domination, a structural correction designed to prevent the same tragedy from ever repeating itself, built from the same careful, patient philosophy that had shaped Earth's entire response from the very beginning. A year passed before I found myself standing again in the great council hall, the same vast chamber where I had once watched Ambassador Hollis die in front of an audience that offered him no protest, no objection, no acknowledgement of the injustice unfolding before them. The chamber looked exactly as it had that day, gleaming and vast, rings of glass and metal rising toward a ceiling that made every visitor feel appropriately small beneath it. But the atmosphere inside had changed completely. I had been asked to return for the formal dedication of a memorial, placed at the exact spot where the execution had occurred, a small, understated marker, bearing Ambassador Hollis's name, alongside a simple inscription describing his role in shaping the oversight framework that now governed diplomatic proceedings across the entire council. I found it strange, standing there, that a tragedy I had witnessed firsthand had eventually produced something the council itself now seemed genuinely proud to acknowledge, rather than something to bury and forget. Councillor Vashari attended the dedication personally, a gesture I hadn't expected given his role in the original verdict. He approached me afterward, his manner considerably more subdued than it had been during our tense negotiations months earlier. "I think of that day often," he said quietly, without any of the formal diplomatic posturing that had characterized our earlier interactions. "I believed, at the time, that I was protecting the council from instability. I understand now that I was protecting nothing except my own fear of what I didn't understand." I studied him for a long moment, uncertain how to respond to an admission I never expected to receive from someone who had once presided so casually over a decision that ended a good man's life. "Understanding comes too late for Ambassador Hollis," I said finally. "But it doesn't have to come too late for everyone else who might have faced the same fate, had nothing changed." He nodded slowly, something like genuine regret settling into his expression, before he excused himself and returned to the gathered dignitaries assembling for the formal proceedings. I stood alone for a while afterward, looking at the small memorial marker, remembering the 2 seconds that had changed everything, remembering the long night of silence that followed, remembering the countdown ticking downward at the border, while an entire coalition scrambled to understand a threat it had spent generations failing to take seriously. Elliot found me there eventually, his presence quiet and familiar after everything we had endured together over the preceding year. "It's strange," I told him, staring at the inscription bearing Ambassador Hollis's name. "Other species used to see us as unpredictable, dangerous, in the way that untested things are dangerous. I think that's changed now, but I'm not sure it's changed into something better. I think they see us differently now, but I don't know if different means safer." Elliot considered this for a long moment before answering. "I think they see us as something they finally understand, even if that understanding frightens them. Before, they feared us because they didn't know what we might do. Now they respect us and fear us in equal measure because they know exactly what we're capable of, and they know we won't act on that capability unless genuinely provoked beyond any reasonable doubt." "Is that better?" "I think it's honest," he said. "And I think honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is exactly the kind of foundation lasting peace requires. The Council no longer sees us as an unpredictable animal that might lash out without reason. They see us as something that plans carefully, acts deliberately, and never bluffs about consequences it isn't prepared to deliver. That kind of reputation doesn't invite casual aggression the way unpredictability once did." I thought about my mother's stories again, about the long, painful reconstruction that had shaped Earth's entire philosophy toward power and restraint, about a civilization that learned, through unimaginable suffering, that the greatest strength lay not in constant demonstration, but in quiet, patient certainty, held carefully in reserve. I thought about Ambassador Hollis, sharing that same philosophy with curious young scholars who only wanted to understand where we had come from, never imagining that curiosity would cost him his life, and never imagining that his death would ultimately prove the very lesson he had been trying to teach. Standing there in that vast chamber, beneath the memorial marker bearing his name, I finally understood something that had eluded me throughout the entire ordeal. Earth had not answered violence with violence, nor grief with vengeance. It had answered injustice with the same patient, deliberate philosophy that had guided its recovery from its own darkest era, proving through quiet restraint, rather than overwhelming force, that some lines, once crossed, could never be crossed again without absolute certainty of consequence. We hadn't gone to war that day at the border. We had simply made certain, permanently and unmistakably, that no governing body across the stars would ever again mistake the safety of an Earth envoy for something disposable, something that could be discarded without cost. I left the council hall that afternoon with the same quiet ache I had carried since the day of the execution, though it felt different now, tempered by something closer to purpose than grief alone. Ambassador Hollis had died believing in the value of honest history, in the idea that sharing our mistakes openly made us stronger rather than weaker. He never lived to see the oversight framework his death had inspired, never lived to see the careful, structural correction that would protect envoys like him for generations to come. But somewhere in that quiet chamber, beneath a memorial finally honored rather than ignored, his belief had been proven true in the most unexpected way imaginable. Our history, however painful, had shaped a doctrine capable of answering injustice without descending into the very violence that history had taught us to fear. And in the end, that doctrine had done exactly what it was always designed to do. It had ensured that no one would ever again have to ask what might happen if they killed one of us without consequence. Because now, across every system touched by the Council's reach, everyone already knew.